Nick Shirley, the pro-Trump influencer whose viral claims around fraud involving Somali-run daycares, which, fueled weeks of chaos in Minnesota, he has now set his sights on California. Right, he's actually just one of several right-wing content creators and even administration officials who have descended onto the state with similar allegations, possibly setting the stage for another Minnesota-style crackdown. Right, because before you had an army of federal agents wreaking havoc in the Twin Cities, you had Democratic Governor Tim Walz at the helm, while you had fraudsters making off with hundreds of millions of dollars in state money meant to help people in need during the pandemic. And that is in fact something that has happened in many states, although the scale was especially shocking in Minnesota. And what ended up actually happening is you had the Trump administration now zeroing in on a years-old case that federal prosecutors had even started charging people for way back in 2022 under Joe Biden. In the current admin, they really emphasize the involvement of dozens of Somali Americans, even though there are tens of thousands of them in the state. The fact that a handful of them were engaged in fraud, it's not a reason to believe that many, many others have, but either way, this case, it was most likely a matter for criminal investigators, not immigration enforcement, especially since 87% of Minnesota's foreign-born Somali population are already American citizens. But still, what you had was Trump calling Somalis garbage and low IQ, suggesting that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar should be deported, and allegations of widespread fraud among Somali and other immigrant communities. It became part of the implied justification for this massive surge of immigration agents to the state in early December. And that was especially true after Nick Shirley claimed to have uncovered a $100 million fraud scheme involving Somali childcare centers in Minnesota, although he did so without providing any real or at least conclusive evidence. And in fact, the Minnesota Department of Children, Youth, and Families reported carrying out checks on 9 child care centers accused of fraud in Shirley's video and found that all were operating as expected. Though notably, you also had the agency revealing ongoing investigations at 4 of the centers on the list, and in total, it is 55 open investigations involving providers that are getting government funding. And so I say that because the point isn't to say that there are not any issues and that there isn't any fraud at all. Right? In fact, going back years, news outlets have published multiple stories covering childcare fraud, and several people, like I said, have been prosecuted. But you had Shirley implying that this had never been discussed, and he manufactured outrage on unsubstantiated and overblown allegations. And it was then after his video that the Trump administration moved to send another roughly 2,000 federal agents to the city, with it then being just 2 more days until ICE agent Jonathan Ross shot and killed Renee Good. Right, and since then, we've just seen an absolute flood of videos appearing to show federal agents violently arresting immigrants and citizens, brutally cracking down on protesters, and shooting and killing American citizen Alex Preddy. And then in addition to the chaos on the ground, you had the White House moving to freeze federal childcare funding for Minnesota and 5 other Democratic-led states, although you had a federal judge temporarily blocking that effort. And now today, we're seeing Border Czar Tom Homan saying that 700 agents will be leaving the state. But of course, that brings us to the question of where will they go next? Because you have some saying that the Trump administration and the MAGA influencer machine, they may be planning to follow the same playbook elsewhere. And in fact, to that point, you reportedly had a senior White House official telling Wired as far back as last month, the fraud is so blatant and widespread in Minnesota that it's a good place to start, but it's only the beginning. California and New York next. You also had Trump claiming in early January that California under Governor Gavin Newsom is more corrupt than Minnesota, and adding, investigation of California has begun. Right, and then last week, he created and filled a brand new position at the Justice Department, Assistant Attorney General for National Fraud Enforcement. And while we haven't heard much from him yet, what we do know is that Shirley is on the ground in San Diego, and again, appears to be targeting Somali-run childcare centers. He's also reportedly been working with a woman named Amy Rakert, a failed politician turned private investigator who's been showing him around. She's also now posted a picture with Shirley on Twitter, writing, "California, here we come. When Nick Shirley drops the video, it's going to be fire." And with that, Shirley appears to be investigating fraud in California the same way that he investigated fraud in Minnesota, which was by showing up to daycares and just asking to see their children, at least based on the videos posted online.
It says there's 14 children enrolled here.
You don't care. This is my daycare.
Then where are the children?
You don't care.
Where are the children at?
It's not enough, Minnesota. You come here.
And it seems like he's not the only one, right? You had a San Diego Somali daycare workers first describing incidents of harassment and unwanted visitors in early January. Some reporting that they've had strangers showing up and peering through their windows, asking questions and hurling false accusations, and ultimately saying that they're fearing for their safety. One, for example, told AP reporters that she watched someone come out from a car that had been circling the building and take a shit near the center's entrance, and that same day, someone drove by and yelled that the center was a fake daycare. And so these types of incidents, they've led to her coming up with new lockdown procedures to start budgeting for increased security. And she also said that she now keeps the blinds closed to protect the children from people looking in, as well as to keep them from looking out and witnessing potentially scarring scenes of immigration enforcement in action. And also, I'll say a huge thing here while we're talking about California, this trend that Shirley started, it seems to have gone nationwide. So cities with large Somali communities in Washington and Ohio, for example, they've also reported incidents. And in Ohio, you actually had the Republican governor holding a news conference to debunk a right-wing influencer's claims about fraud tied to a childcare center in Columbus, where the governor is saying, and I don't know why this does need to be said, a childcare provider provider refusing to let a stranger into the building and look at the children should not be seen as a sign of fraud. But also, that hasn't stopped Republicans in the state legislature from actually introducing legislation to more closely monitor childcare centers. And that includes one that would require those that take public money to provide live video feeds of their classrooms to state officials. But getting back to California, the fraud allegations have also gone beyond daycare facilities. You're also seeing pro-Trump influencer Benny Johnson, for example, publishing his own documentary this weekend, with him claiming to have uncovered a $100 million fraud scheme in California tied to what he called the homeless industrial complex. He then also claimed that the state was using these federal dollars to rig national elections, although notably you had California Governor Gavin Newsom's office responding to that video with a detailed fact-check writing, "We watched Benny Johnson's video so you didn't have to lose brain cells." As expected, lies, rage bait, straight from his Russia-paid influencer starter kit. And as an example, Johnson's video tries to claim that California's homeless shelters are mostly filled with undocumented immigrants, but his main piece of evidence, it's a phone call with a purported whistleblower whose identity was kept hidden. And you had Newsom's office slamming the claim as being as real as our free unicorn for all undocumented people program. We've also recently had Mehmet Oz getting in on the action, right? He's part of the Trump administration. He's the administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So also, I guess, possibly relevant to a conversation about fraud, he rose to fame in the eyes of many as something of a modern-day snake oil salesman, right? With Oz touting his medical background while promoting unsound scientific theories, unproven treatments, and bogus supplements, sometimes sold by companies that he had financial ties to. But in any case, last month he said that CMS would withhold around $300 million in funding from California because, according to him, it was using the funds on non-emergency healthcare for illegals. And then last week, he published his own documentary-style video on alleged healthcare fraud in California involving phony hospices that he suggested were run by the Russian-Armenian mafia. Also, I'll say notably, neither Oz nor CMS have publicly shared details that confirm the fraud. And then the whole thing for many becomes especially problematic because Oz's parents came from Turkey, which, like Oz himself, in fact, has refused to acknowledge the history of the Armenian genocide. And so you actually had Governor Gavin Newsom's office filing a civil rights complaint against Oz after the video was published, saying that Oz spewed baseless and racially charged allegations. Also, funny enough, you had Newsom's office pointing to the fact that Trump himself has actually halted a federal effort to increase oversight on hospice care and root out fraud and abuse in the industry. And all of this is, notably, he did not deny that fraud happens, but he insisted that the state was taking action. And actually with that, you had the California Attorney General's office saying that it has filed criminal charges against 109 individuals over hospice fraud-related offenses and launched dozens of civil investigations. And as far as fraud tied to services for unhoused people, just last month, a man was arrested for getting away with $23 million from LA County funds. And so again, the argument is not that no fraud is happening anywhere or that fraud is fake. Fraud is real. There's fraud happening here and there, and there's a debate to be had about whether California or any other state or the federal government is doing enough to combat it. But also, there are reasons to be skeptical about a number of the things that are being claimed, and there's reason to doubt that Trump and his supporters are coming at the issue in good faith, right? Especially as there's a question about whether the issue is going to be used again to justify some sort of action against California or other states opposed to Trump's agenda.